Share a message with you from this week's Parshat Titzave. One of my favorite games growing up was a game called Tag. I liked it a lot because it was a game that I was particularly good at because I was pretty fast. So the game was pretty simple. One person started off as it, and they would run out trying to touch people and get them, therefore, to be on their team. And as each person was touched, the team grew larger and stronger until everybody was essentially on the same team. And that, to me, was a lot of fun. It reminded me, of course, of this week's Parsha, in which one person, and then ultimately his sons, were chosen as it. They were the people who had to go out and bring holiness to the people. Even though the Parsha starts off by saying that we are to build a tabernacle for God, v'shachanti b'tocham, in order that God might dwell amongst us, suggesting that, of course, God lives within each one of us, the Parsha also reminds us that there are certain places we go to for greater holiness. The Parsha then builds in terms of the association with Aaron and his sons, the garments that they would wear, the ultimate ordination ceremony that they would experience, that would bring holiness to them, and then ultimately through them, holiness to the Jewish people. And so time and time again, this week's Parsha reminds us it's not just about the priesthood, but it's also about the people of Bnei Yisrael, the people of Israel. And in one great verse, this week's Parsha says the following: V'kidashta oto v'haya hamizbeach kodesh kodeshim. And they made it holy, and the altar was the holy of holies. Kol hanogea b'mizbeach yikdash. And everything that touched that altar became holy. It's possible to think that the most unworthy could come into contact with this holy place and disrupt that worship. But the Torah teaches us that's not true, because holiness is contagious. It can't be overwhelmed by something that is impure. There is something infectious in the most positive way about holiness. Just a few weeks earlier in Parshat Yitro, we have the commandment from Moses to the Jewish people that they're supposed to ready themselves for the moment of revelation at Sinai. And they're supposed to undergo a variety of different activities, cleaning their clothes and so forth. And they would arrive at the foot of the mountain to experience this moment of God in the world. And Moses says to them, but don't touch the mountain. It says, B'kitseu kol hanogea bahar mochimat, because anybody who touches that mountain will die. The use of the word nogea in both places reminds us that sometimes what we choose to come into contact with and what we choose not to come into contact with has an extraordinary impact on our lives. The idea that the word nogea, to come into contact, to touch, is incredibly important. We recognize immediately that there are touches that are good and there are touches that are bad. It's true in our relationships with each other. It's true with our world in general. This week's Parsha reminds us that there are infections in the world that bring great disease and illness, and there are infections that bring great holiness, happiness, and joy. This week's Parsha says that if we choose to engage in a world that's holy, we'll bring greater holiness to the world. But if we choose to engage in a world that is less than that, then that too is what will be spread. The second game that I remember playing growing up was something called Hot Lava. It was a game in which we would run from furniture to furniture in our living room without touching the ground. Because if you touched the ground, you were out. Says this week's Parsha, what we choose to touch can bring us closer to being part of the team, or what we choose to stay away from means that's not something we want in our lives. This week's Parsha says you have a choice to make. A choice about who you're going to associate with and who you're going to distance yourself from. This week's Parsha says there are activities in which you choose to engage and there are activities that you refuse to be a part of. This week I ask you to make those decisions conscious ones in your lives, and through that we'll gain a capacity to be greater than we are and bring greater holiness to our world. Have a wonderful Bye.